It's the technical piece that is the most challenging. See. Hey! Oh, boo! What is going on? Okay. So, I promise. So, death and dying in the Episcopal Church. So there's an easy answer to give, which is the sort of applied ethics piece, and then there's the normative ethics piece, which is really hard. What the heck am I talking about? A fine question. So when ethicists talk about ethics, sometimes they talk about applied ethics, which are like basically the lists of rules. So if you're a doctor and you do a course in medical ethics will be things like this is the kind of consent that you need from a patient before a live organ transplant. This is what they need to know they're getting into. These are the risks. Like, you have to tell them all this. That's a good ethical thing to do, but it's really more just a rule that you follow, if that makes sense. So applied ethics are kind of like rules. Normative ethics describe like ethical ways of thinking. Like, what makes an act ethical? Whose ethics are we espousing? Upon what principles do they rest? So the applied ethics piece from the Episcopal perspective, what do you do when your spouse is dying, a loved one is dying, what if they're comatose, what if it seems as though they're so sick they're not going to recover? The applied ethics piece is easy. So resolve, the 70th General Convention set forth the following principles and guidelines with regard to the foregoing of life-sustaining treatment in the light of our understanding of the sacredness of human life. It's morally wrong and unacceptable to take a human life in order to relieve the suffering caused by incurable illness. It's a pretty broad statement. This would include the intentional shortening of another person's life by denying the use of a lethal dose of medication, or poison, the use of lethal weapons, homicidal acts, and other forms of active euthanasia. So euthanasia is out for the Episcopal Church.
What year is this?
That's a good question. I think this was
30 years ago.
Yeah.
30 years ago.
Yeah, 30 years ago. However, there's no moral obligation to prolong the act of dying by extraordinary means and at all costs, if such dying person is ill and has no reasonable expectation of recovery. So on the one hand, euthanasia out. On the other hand, prolonging life by extraordinary means not ruled out. But that's not something one is obliged to do. In those cases involving persons who are in a comatose state from which there is no reasonable expectation of recovery, subject to legal restraints, this church's members are urged to seek the advice and counsel of members of the church community, and where appropriate, its sacramental life, in contemplating the withholding or removing of life-sustaining systems, including hydration and nutrition. So it's kind of a nuanced, very Anglican thing to say euthanasia is completely out, removal of life support systems is an option. So please.
But this is only for people who are having to make the decision at the moment. What are the ethics of the person making those decisions in advance for himself?
That's a great question. So Susan's question was, this is only for someone making the decision for someone else in the moment. What are the ethics of someone making those decisions in advance for themselves? I think the intent would be the same. So I think if you say, I don't want to live past 27, never trust an adult, I want euthanasia at the age of 27 no matter what, that's out for the Episcopal Church. If you say, I don't want to be kept alive by extraordinary means, I don't want to be on sort of breathing apparatus after I can no longer breathe for myself, I think that's within the sort of vision of this statement. So I think this is helpful in terms of having just a broad policy. I think it's sort of unhelpful in terms of thinking about what to do in the hospital room, So on the one hand, I know that I can't pull out my AK-47 and kill someone. I also know that it's not prohibited if someone is completely comatose, only being kept alive by some machine that's actively making their heart pump and they're never going to recover. But what about the vast majority of cases which are in between? How do I deal with those? Please.
So medical assistance in dying is legal in DC. So if you had a parishioner that was going to use that option, would you then not be willing to not give last rites?
So we don't actually give last rites in the Episcopal Church. We have unction, we have communion. So I would give unction to anyone and communion to anyone who is a baptized Christian in the hospital. So literally, if somebody just walked in the door and was like, "I'm really sick, can I have unction?" I'd say sure. So it's not so much a question of like we withhold something from the church, but if someone said, I'm considering undertaking a sort of assisted process of dying, I would say that that's not something the Episcopal Church advises. It's such a, well, this is actually a perfect question because this gets into what we're actually going to talk about, which is super helpful, Sally. Thank you. So in applied ethics, we have ordinary versus extraordinary needs. Where does this distinction come from? Our old friend, Francisco de Vitoria, the main man in ethics in his era. So we talked about his kind of ethics around combat situations last time. This ordinary versus extraordinary distinction largely comes from his work as well. Funny that he's not a household name. In the case that's been presented, I believe, that the person is not obliged to give all his patrimony to preserve his life. The result is that, if one becomes so sick as to have no hope for life, admitting that a certain valuable medication might procure hours or even days of life, he would not be obliged to buy it, but it would be sufficient to utilize the common remedies. So, he's kind of drawing this distinction between, okay, you're dying, there's this drug that will keep you alive for another 4 hours. Do you spend your life savings to buy this drug, or do you pass on your life savings to the next generation? You're not actually obliged to buy this drug. You don't have to use an extraordinary means to keep life going. This is kind of his distinction. But still, ordinary versus extraordinary. This is a hard thing to define. So this is where normative ethics comes in. So normative ethics are kind of big questions. Can an ordinary means of preserving life become an extraordinary means? Do those standards differ from case to case? Could there be a case in which suicide is justified? These are the things we actually have to think through. So, you might say, I'm not a philosopher who cares about this stuff, much like Frank Sinatra. But if you face an ethical problem without an obvious solution, you have to think it through with clarity. If the solution seems obvious to you, but a colleague or a family member or your priest disagrees, you'll need reasons to help them reach your conclusion. So there are 4 primary ethical traditions of Western philosophy. So in the East, there are South Asian traditions, there are Chinese traditions that are totally separate from these and have just as long a pedigree of being thought through and used by humankind, but being a Westerner, I know the Western types. So what is deontology? You have consequentialism, and its most common form, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and divine command theory, which many would argue is a subset of deontology. What are all these crazy jargon words I'm using? I will tell you. So it's good to know that these 4 schools, these 4 ways of doing ethics, these are not like you have to pick one football team and stick to that one. These are kind of 4 different tools for thinking through a situation like my loved one is really ill, there's very little hope of recovery, how long do we keep them in the hospital bed? So deontology, this guy, Immanuel Kant, looking super chill, as he usually does. The word deontology derives from the Greek word for duty, deion, the study, logos, so the study of duty. So Kant says there are things called hypothetical imperatives. And this is something that commands an action, is an imperative. And a hypothetical imperative relies on my desire. Again, like, what are all these crazy big terms? So, if you have a desire, plus a belief, you get an imperative. So, I want to be at work by 9 a.m. My office, this is purely hypothetical for me, is 20 minutes away from my home. My imperative, I should leave the house by 8:40. So I have this belief, I have this desire, I gotta be at work by a certain time. I have a belief about where my office is, how long it's going to take me to get there. The should that I arrive at is leave at 8:40. Does that make sense? Nothing super philosophically complex about that. But I have this understanding of the way the world is. I have this thing that I want to do, so I kind of do the math and I get the should. I get the what I ought to do in that moment. Or I realize that it's my day off, and a new desire produces a different imperative. So go to the movies instead.
Is a belief kind of an assumption then, and more factual, desire more normative?
Yeah, desire is just the thing that I want, and then a belief is just my understanding of the state of the world. So just kind of
like a neutral understanding.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, whereas
that's right.
the desire is more my ethical.
Yeah.
system?
It's ethical system or just kind of what I want. Like, I want to get yogurt at the grocery store. I know that Whole Foods doesn't carry the yogurt I like. Therefore, the imperative is I have to go to Giant. It's just kind of like, I have this thing that I want, and here's how I'm going to have to negotiate the world to get there. That's the should that I get. So nothing very magical or amazing about that. But Kant has this idea that there are some imperatives that just come from the belief, and the desire is irrelevant. And this is where it gets interesting. So you have the situation, I just bought this new suit, which I did, from the op shop for $15. Looking good. Brooks Brothers. Thank you. It's my last chance to wear it. It's flannel, so it's going in the closet for the summer. I just bought a new suit and I would like to care for it. A child is drowning in a pool. I ruined the suit by jumping into the pool to save the child. So in this situation, my desire has nothing to do with my duty, right? Like, my desire, keep the suit for the next 30 years and wear it. The actual, by my belief, is that this child is drowning. My desire does not matter. I have to jump in the pool and ruin the suit, right? Like, no one would not make that decision unless they were morally impaired. So this is what Kant calls a categorical imperative. It's when your belief creates the duty. What you feel about it, what you think about it, what you want to do, totally irrelevant. You have a duty based on the facts of what's happening. Does that make sense? So we have these kind of clear situations, like someone is dying, you have to save a life, like a drowning child. But then there are kind of more interesting, kind of philosophically extrapolated cases in which Kant can say you have a duty to do something just based on the facts, your desire regardless, that aren't these extreme cases of a drowning child. He says, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So I have a moral imperative to do things which I would will become a universal law. So if I have, let's say there's a situation in which it is financially advantageous for me to break a promise or tell a lie. And I want to say, I'm an honest person, I like being an honest person, I value honesty, but in this case, $5,000 is on the line, I'm going to do this one dishonest thing, just for the heck of it, it's not really going to hurt anybody, I'm going to make $5,000, I'll worry about that later. I'll worry about my little dishonest act later. So you might think that for yourself, but then what if you extrapolated to the world and you decided that everybody has the right to break a promise or tell a lie when more than $500 is on the line? How would you ever have a contract that's functional in the world if you know that everybody has the right to break a promise if more than $500 is on the line? How would you ever sell a house? How would you ever buy a car? How would you ever do anything? Contracts would be completely meaningless. Promises about anything more than $500 would be completely meaningless. You live in this world in which there is no trust, there is no sort of convenience of doing things contractually. It would make life really complicated, right? So Kant would say, you have this imperative to not lie about things, to not break your promises, to not just break contracts willy-nilly. You actually have this imperative to be truthful, to be honest in your dealings. The other one I'll touch on, because we don't have a ton of time, humans are always to be treated as an end rather than a means to an end. So my car is always a means to an end, I want to get yogurt, I get in my car, I go get the yogurt. My car is just a means. But Mary is not a means to an end for me, If I need something from Mary, I don't say so Mary, could you just maybe leave your keys there because they're really heavy, and can you go to the sacristy and grab something for me? And then I take her keys and I get in the car and I drive away because she's just a means to my end. Instead, I would say you're an end in and of yourself. I need a big favor. Could I borrow your car to go get yogurt? And you're like, what's so pressing about yogurt? I'm like, I can't talk about it. It's a really big deal. I don't want to tell you a lie, but so, like, humans always have to be ends rather than means to an end. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good one. So I'm going to go on from Kant, especially because I see Mark sitting in the back who has a PhD in Kant. So, deontology, always do the right thing. It's about doing the right thing. It doesn't really matter, per se, what the outcome is. It doesn't really matter what society thinks about it. It's about you doing the right thing in any given situation. Does that make sense? So that's one way of thinking about ethics. So, I'll just, one hypothetical here. Sorry, I'm gonna go through my slides. So a terrorist has a ticking time bomb hidden somewhere in the city. You may be able to get him to tell you the location of the bomb, thereby saving 100 lives if you just torture a single child. What does Kant want you to do in that situation? Don't torture anybody! That child is not a means to your end of saving lives. That child is an end in and of herself. So you can't torture the child. So for Kant, even though you might lose 1,000 or 100 lives, whatever I said in this crazy hypothetical, you still can't take or even diminish that one life to get there. You still have to be a good person and do the right thing. So one way to think about when your loved one is lying in the coma is like, what is the right thing in the situation? Not thinking about the law, not even thinking, shocking as it is for me to say this, about the rules of the Episcopal Church, not thinking about the pain that they're enduring, not thinking about the cost of keeping them on life support, just like asking yourself, what is the right thing to do here? What's the thing that I would want everyone to do in this situation? What is the thing that treats this person as an end and not as a means? Like, how do I do the right thing in this moment? One good question to ask yourself. Please.
Does this mean that there's no just war for Kant?
Oh, great question. Yes.
Sanctity of the individual trumps all utilitarian.
That's a great question. So he asks, is there no just war for Kant? Is he ultimately a pacifist because you can't, the sanctity of sort of individual life is so important? I would say no. I'm going to phone a friend and defer to Mark. What do you say, Mark?
No, but I also not quite sure actually.
Yeah,
I forgot whether the positive was in the negative answer or the positive answer. So, when you say, so the question is whether Kant believed you could ever use force, thereby ending an individual life for a greater good, such as a just war. So when you say no, you mean no, Kant did not believe that a war could ever be just?
No, I don't think Kant was a pacifist. I actually don't know that's the question.
And I'm actually, so I think that Mark should do some research on this because he's the most qualified in the room. And if he doesn't,
On the bike trip.
I want to, Mr. Lewis, I'm actually going to hold other questions and we're just going to kind of zip through these different types.
Is Jesus Hebrew?
Yes, great question. Thank you. Consequentialism. It's all about the outcomes. So doing the right thing is nice, but if 1,000 people are going to die, like actually let's care about those 1,000 people, you know? Like it's good to be this just moral person who never tells a lie. If Anne Frank is in your attic, tell a lie, you know? Like protect her. Like that's crazy thinking. So everything is about outcomes. Most common form of consequentialism is utilitarianism, greatest happiness for the greatest number, but there are lots of different forms of consequentialism. So you could say, what produces the greatest amount of freedom for the most people, which is libertarianism. You could say, what produces, I mean, we could sort of think of anything as the consequence we are looking for. Like what would produce the situation in our society in which everybody gets 8 hours of sleep a night. Let's make every decision based on a society where everybody gets 8 hours of sleep. Whatever it is, you can sort of make that outcome your ultimate goal and tailor everything to that. So the ethical question you're asking is not, is this the right thing? It is what produces the good outcome. Does that make sense? So you have John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, these are kind of the big names in this world. Egalitarian ethics. Does this promote equality for the greatest number of people? The ends justifies the means, proven from Jesuit authors who have been taught for over 350 years. there actually is, this gets like, this kind of becomes a smear against Jesuits, but there is a sort of line of thinking in Jesuit scholarship, kind of in the Renaissance period, about what it is to do something that's maybe not the right thing and produce the right outcome and sort of justifying that. So it's kind of interesting. Machiavelli gets sort of quoted as being like Mr. Ends justify the means. Doesn't actually use that phrase, but that is sort of like where he's going in The Prince. So it's this idea of like, it's the outcome that matters. Whatever you do to get to that good outcome is ultimately the right thing. So a very different way of thinking. So on the one hand, consequentialism leads to things like slavery. You know, if you enslave 10% of the population, then life is, which is a terrible thing. This is what I would call like a repugnant conclusion from consequentialism. But the idea would be that like the majority of the population benefits from the suffering of the minority. This leads to things like using starvation as a weapon of war. Using sexual assault as a weapon of war. If you can end the conflict sooner, if you can defeat your enemy sooner, any means are sufficient for that. So all these repugnant conclusions. In this case, where you have the ticking time bomb, the guy knows where the time bomb is, the terrorist, and you can torture his child or children, that's, the consequentialist says, you only have one option here. You've got to save those lives. You got to do it. If you have a situation, this is when I'm teaching medical folks, the one I always use, these are all military medical folks who run military hospitals all over the world. If you have a situation in which you have a soldier who's just trying to take his own life, and he is conscious and he says, please help me take my own life, I do not want to be here, I hate this world, I would have to move on from this world, and you know that you could save 10 other active duty military personnel who are active in combat with his organs, what does the consequentialist say? And I tell them, if any of you say this is the right thing, we're all going to report you to your boards. Because this is horrible. This is a horrible way of thinking, right? There are even some consequentialists who would say, okay, you could help those 10 people, but then you have to live in a world in which anytime you go to the doctor, there's a high risk they're going to just take your organs, and so nobody ever goes to the doctor. So that actually diminishes the happiness for the greatest number. That's called rural consequentialism. But ultimately, like consequentialism, on the one hand, you cannot ignore. So if your loved one is lying in bed, they are in extreme suffering, there is no hope for recovery, you have to be like, okay, so the outcome of continuing your suffering is continuing your suffering. That's rough. Like, I'm going to take that into account. On the other hand, if I think in any situation you say, forget about the right thing, I'm just going to think of the outcomes, you're down a pretty slippery slope to some bad stuff. Does that make sense? Yeah. So consequentialism, essential, necessary, gotta think about it. If it's your only guiding light, you become a pretty rough person. Virtue ethics. So it's surprising for some people to know that both consequentialism, thinking about the outcome, and this idea that there are just these universal rights that logic leads us to, these are pretty new ways of doing ethics. So from the ancient Greeks, certainly from Aristotle, but before Aristotle as well, but really well articulated in Aristotle, all the way up through like the 17th century, when you talked about ethics, most people were talking about doing this kind of ethics. And it's a way, it's one that has been so replaced by consequentialism and deontology, like duty, doing the right thing, and the outcomes, that's almost foreign to us. So in the 1940s, 1950s, a wonderful scholar at Cambridge, I believe, Elizabeth Anscombe, starts kind of resurrecting Aristotle's ethics. And it gets called in the 20th century virtue ethics. So ethics, from this really ancient perspective, is asking yourself the question, what would a good person do in this situation? So, let's say you go to Home Depot and you're going to buy a rose bush. If I go to Home Depot and I buy a rose bush, this is what the rose bush will be like. Within like 6 days. Tragic. If Rahel buys the rose bush and is taking care of the rose bush, it'll be like this in like a year. And you might say, okay, you know, these are just two arbitrary states. But from one philosophical perspective, everything has what's called a telos, an end towards which it's moving. So this is not the end towards which the rose bush is moving. This is like a sort of diminished, insufficient version of the rose bush. Fullness of life for the rose bush looks like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you have like an acorn, some acorns just get eaten by squirrels, some get driven over by my car or whatever, but some acorns, when you plant them in the ground, turn into gigantic trees. So the telos for Aristotle of an acorn is becoming a gigantic, huge tree. You can find shade under its boughs. You know, you can chop it down and build a big chunk of a house or whatever. So the telos of a plant looks like that. For Aristotle, human beings also have a telos. So in the way that we can be like, whoops, darn it, sorry. Slides, tricky. In the way that a rose bush can be like this, I can live my life in such a way that I'm becoming meaner and meaner spirited, if that's a word, more and more fearful or jealous or angry or greedy. I can just sort of get smaller and smaller and less kind, less and less good. That is like the opposite of my telos. That is me being like this, like a diminished rose bush. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or I can live in such a way that I'm always growing in courage. I become more and more courageous with each action. I become more and more generous with each action. I become more and more selfless or kind. So that is me growing into the kind of full rose bush, like actually realizing my telos. Does that make sense? So for Aristotle, these things don't happen through a conscious decision. You know, you don't join the military one day and say, I'm going to be courageous, full stop, that's it. Instead, you do this through establishing habits of courage. So in basic training, they're going to try and get you to be more and more courageous. When you are in your first posting, you'll be more and more courageous. In combat, you learn to be more and more courageous. So courage is something that grows in you through repetition. And that repetition becomes a habit, such that when I'm in a difficult situation, you know, when I have to confront someone about something I feel really awkward about, I don't sort of like hem and haw and make a pro and con list of talking to the person and sort of pace and think about it and stay up all night. I just immediately talk to that person because I have this habit of courage. I don't just become generous because one day I wake up and decide to be a generous person. It starts by sharing, like Mark was saying in the sermon, sharing as a child, sharing a little bit of what I have, sharing more and more on what I have. And over time, I build up these habits of generosity such that if someone says like, hey, can you help me? I'm like, sure. You know, I just have this habit. That's just my inclination. And so all these habits form what gets referred to as your character. So you're building this telos of a rose bush. So you could be in a situation in which a loved one is dying, is suffering, whatever, and you think like, what would a selfless person do in this moment? What would a courageous person, what would just a good person do in this moment? And it's a way to kind of like check the line of thinking that you're on. But in a way, like even to sort of do virtue ethics, you have to be leading this life of virtue. These virtues have to be meaningful to you, not just as kind of examples in books or in philosophy papers or whatever, but as things that you live out and things that you experience. Does that make sense? So we have these different ways of thinking about ethics. So it's hard to make all decisions in this way, but not including this line of ethical thought leads to defining a good person strictly by only the outcomes of their actions or the strictness to which they adhere to rules. So if I define everything just in terms of consequences, let's say there's this guy. He hates humanity. He is a misanthrope, and he's always trying to kill people. but he's also a bungler. He's terrible at killing people, and he tries to kill people by throwing gold bars at them, but he always misses, and so people are always like, a gold bar for me, amazing! So from a consequentialist sort of account, this is like one of the greatest humanitarians ever. Like, he's a really good person. He's just constantly benefiting people, never hurting them, even though he's actually trying to kill people. That's crazy. From a deontologist's account, you have someone who is like so sure of the 9 principles she lives by. She only thinks about these in every situation. She's rigorously attached to doing the right thing. But it's actually like terrible for everyone around her because she has no flexibility, she has no concern for others. Does anybody know the Gilbert and Sullivan musical, The Princess Ida?
No.
So, I'll tell you about it. So, you have this character, King Gamma, and he says, "If you give me your attention, I will tell you what I am. I'm a genuine philanthropist, all other kinds of sham. Each little fault of temper and each little social defect in my erring fellow creatures I endeavor to correct. To all their little weaknesses I open people's eyes, and little plans to snub the self-sufficient I devise. I love my fellow creatures, I do all the good I can, yet everybody says I'm such a disagreeable man, and I can't think why. No, we really can't think. It's just a good song, it gets stuck in your head. But he says, like, he's, I can tell a woman's age in a minute, and I do. He says he's a wonderful guy, he has a crushing repartee, a fascinating leer. But anyway, so he's this kind of deontologist. He knows the right rules to live by, and yet he's this awful person. Everybody drives her very crazy. The last one is divine command theory. A moral statement is that which is commanded by God. So if you want to know, is this thing I'm doing ethical? What does God say about it? That's kind of full stop. That is the answer. So now is the quiz portion of our program. Does anybody remember today's epistle from Peter? Ish. If anybody, what's a little bit of the ish that you remember? So to take on suffering for doing the right thing, this is approved by God. So if you are suffering for doing the right thing, this is a holy and good thing. Not that suffering is good, not that God wants anybody to suffer, but if you're like, I'm suffering because of a just action, that's not a sign that God is not, you don't have God's favor. That actually is, that's what the lives of the saints look like. That's what the crucifixion looks like. So you have a principle like thou shalt not kill. In 1941, in Auschwitz, a prisoner successfully escaped, and the camp policy was to arbitrarily take 10 prisoners and starve them to death. So 10 prisoners were going to be put in this underground cell and starved. And there was this guy, Francis Gal, if anybody's Polish, forgive me, Gajałusnek. And when the commandant said, or when the people of the commandant ordered to do this, said, we're picking 10 prisoners, you're one of them, Francis. He said, please, I have little children, I have a wife. Polish soldier, sergeant, I think. And so this other prisoner, Maximilian Kolbe, Franciscan friar, who had lived all over the world, I think founded either part or all of the Franciscan order in Japan. He owned this huge Catholic publishing house, not owned because Franciscans don't own anything, but he started this huge Catholic publishing house and radio station in Poland. He was this massive cultural figure without thinking, because he was courageous, without thinking, because he was good. He just stepped forward and said, I'll take his place. And so the Nazis said, sure, fine. And so he was taken down to this hole in the ground, and with 9 other people, almost starved to death. He led them in prayer, he led them in songs of praise and psalms the whole time. And by the end of this long period after which they should have been dead, he and 2 others were just still living. And so they were finally executed. This guy, Gajałusnek, lived until 1995. He died at the age of 95, and he spent his life basically telling the story of Maximilian Kolbe, this holy man who saved him. For Maximilian Kolbe, consequentially, if you're sort of thinking about yourself, this is not a good outcome, being starved to death. You want to keep your head down, you don't want to do that. If you're thinking about just sort of like the consequences for the world, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, it's a one-to-one trade-off, Like, either he dies or Francis dies, like, it doesn't really make a difference. From a deontological perspective, he did not have to do this. There's no universal law that says anytime someone is going to die, you should step in for them and die yourself. He just did it because he's a Christian. Like, if this is what God commands, this is what I want to do. He was all in for divine command theory. So I think also in making decisions for your loved ones who are in this state, you have to ask, what does God ask of me? Like, what is God's will for this person at this time? So to kind of like round this off, the Episcopal Church prohibits euthanasia, and the Episcopal Church has a very broad understanding of the ordinary means to preserve life which have to be utilized, and the extraordinary means which don't have to be utilized. But like making that call, what that means, what that is for you, it's very challenging. And that's where ethics comes in, I think. Questions or thoughts? Please.
I just want to ask your comment about this I said, I just want to address please your comment about this monk who stepped in. You mentioned that he was courageous. He was not just courageous, but he was a person of faith.
100%, absolutely. Melanie pointed out that St. Maximilian Kolbe was a person of faith, which is absolutely right.
He's saint.
St. Maximilian Kolbe, yeah. Other questions or thoughts? Does it seem strange? Oh, please.
When my mother was dying, one of the issues we had was that the family was not in agreement. They were in different places in their struggle to face what was happening. And so it's not just me deciding what the right thing was, but working with the family.
Yeah.
It gets really complicated.
Absolutely. And if you couldn't hear, he was saying that in the case that he was in, there was disagreement between sides of the family about this really important issue, and it just gets so complicated in those cases. That's so true. I have a friend who's one of my closest friends, not a person of faith by any stretch. Great sport, was at my ordination, has been to a million services, lovely person, even read the New Testament, and he was just like, I don't really get it. He's an attorney and does civil rights law, and they do a lot of pro bono cases, but then they also take on these cases from nonprofits. And his firm took on this case for I think it's a Canadian Roman Catholic group that are anti-assisted suicide, and like trying to basically like lobby for the revocation of these assisted suicide laws in Canada. And Van was like, I'm pro-assisted suicide. I think this is like malarkey. I don't get any of these sort of religious prohibitions. This is stupid. But after he got into the literature, he actually tried to get another partner at the firm to take the case because he was like, I don't want to do this. After he got into the literature, he actually changed his mind, not based on sort of any religious scruples at all, but just because there's so much evidence in the Canadian context, which I'm sure is different from our context, to suggest that a lot of people were choosing assisted suicide for financial reasons, and that palliative care is just more expensive and people didn't want to go into debt, but that often in these cases, again, different context, different country, but in these Canadian cases, palliative care would have actually improved the life of the person to such an extent that the things that they were considering as causes for assisted suicide might not have been present. So, I don't know, interesting stuff to think about. With that, I'll go to church. Thank you all. File your funeral plans. If you put in, I want assisted suicide, we're going to cross that out. If it's the church doing this, so make of that what you will. Thanks very much.